Welcome to our Animal Justice June panel. It is the Big Ag Front Groups, Disinformation, and Activist Repression. I'm Kimberly Carroll, and I will be your host tonight. I'm a strategist for animal justice, founder of the Animal Justice Academy, and you'll find my bio in the chat. Tonight, folks, we're going to get into some really insidious tactics that the powerful animal ag industry in Canada is taking to protect themselves as the public gets more and more exposure to the horrific conditions for animals raised for food in Canada. We'll be talking about front groups, complex disinformation campaigns, and the attacking of animal advocates. This is something that we're particularly focused on right now in Canada, but it applies basically, you're going to see a lot of threads from different countries. Regardless of where you're joining us from, you're going to see some very similar things going on. Before we dive in the spirit of social justice for all, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all lands throughout the world that all of us, probably many of us, find ourselves on. In Canada, we especially acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. Also, our hearts go out tonight to the humans and animals in war zones and the trillions of animals suffering around the world at this very moment. Thanks. All right, gang, let's get to know our panelists for this evening. First of all, we have Dr. Elizabeth Schoales, who is a former professor of history, who decided she'd rather work for animals. Over the past 20 years, Elizabeth has been able to put her academic research and writing skills to good use, collaborating with numerous organizations on a wide range of animal rights and legal campaigns. Elizabeth has a PhD from the University of Wales. She is joining us from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
And Elizabeth has also been a longtime, member of our community, has been to a lot of animal justice events like this. First time we finally get to put her on the hot seat, so I'm super excited about that. We also have joining us PJ Nyman, who is the corporate engagement manager at Animal Justice, one of my colleagues. Prior to entering the nonprofit sector, PJ earned a master's degree in social and political thought from York University in 2011 and taught and published in the social sciences. As an animal advocate, PJ has managed national campaigns in the US and Canada and led strategy and communications for corporate animal welfare reform in Canada. PJ, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Aw, so good to have you back, PJ. And then for those of you who joined us for our NFAC panel last month, our vision report, I promised we were going to have a part two, and she's a part of it. Dr. Tayler Zavitz is our advocacy program specialist at Animal Justice. Tayler holds a PhD in sociology, specializing in critical animal studies. Her doctoral research offered a deep dive into the history of animal rights movement in Canada and its repression and criminalization. Tayler has spent the last almost decade teaching in academia. She's also a passionate and longtime animal advocate and rescuer with close to 2 decades of experience collaborating with various nonprofits and local orgs to advance animal protection. Tayler, welcome.
Thank you, Kimberly. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
Yay. All right. So, folks, the Animal Justice is about to release a big expose on animal agricultural front groups this summer. And so what we wanted to do was arm you, our community, in advance with some of the information we'll be releasing so that when the expose comes out, you can hit the ground running with helping to take action around it. In fact, we're going to just have a whole flank of coordinated actions that we're going to roll out once our expose is out, that we're going to ask you to take part in. But we just sort of wanted to get you primed for it, really get you sort of in the beginning stages to be able to understand what's happening and the stakes around it. The format this evening is going to be just a little bit different than usual. Each panelist is going to present on what they've uncovered. uninterrupted by me mostly. And I'll do a couple of follow-up questions, maybe based on what you all are curious about in the chat. Then we're going to do a flash action, and then we are going to take some questions from the community. So I'm going to invite Elizabeth to get us rolling here, to get us up to speed on front groups. So Elizabeth, I'm going to get you to take it away with your screen share.
Okay, thank you very much, Kimberly. Well, let's try this sharing again and see if I get it right.
It's so good to see everybody here, by the way. I'm seeing all your comments. Thank you.
Okay, are we?
You're ready to go. Everything looks great, Elizabeth.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here. And as Kimberly mentioned, we're going to be releasing a report on this topic fairly shortly, which is going to be quite in depth. And this is actually quite a complicated topic. It's like an onion that just keeps more and more layers. So what I'm going to give you tonight is just a quick taste of the topic of front groups in Canada, hopefully to get you interested and follow up on this once more information comes out. So what I want to look at tonight is really just the absolute basics. What is an agriculture front group? What do they do? Why are they doing it? And what do animal advocates need to know? What is it that the most important things that we need to understand about these groups so that we can be most effective in responding? Excuse me. So agriculture front groups, you may have heard the term front groups, and agriculture industry is not the only industry that has them. Front groups tend to be funded and directed by large corporations, in this particular instance, agriculture corporations. They use the technique of astroturfing, which is to create themselves, the front group, to look like a grassroots groups made up of ordinary people, in this case farmers and people involved in agriculture, and they generally claim to be educating the public about a particular topic. In this case, agriculture front groups regularly claim just to have the really nice benign purpose of wanting people to understand the agriculture and food better, and particularly they like to use the slogan of teaching people where their food comes from. So the implication is that they want people to understand every step of the way from farm to the food that you purchase. What is their actual goal? That's I think important to know. And this is I think it is quite important for us as advocates to know what's really behind these groups, because this tends to be rather hard for the public to see behind all of the friendly imagery and the good news stories. What they're actually trying to do is secure public acceptance of controversial practices and conventional industrial agriculture. And from our perspective, the standard practices of animal agriculture and some of the awful things that we know exist. And by doing that, what they're trying to achieve is ultimately pretty straightforward: to protect maximum profits by maintaining their unregulated status or freedom to operate. And if you're familiar with the agri-food system in Canada, you'll know that it is very poorly regulated, almost no oversight. It's largely run by the industry. And this is what front groups refer to as their social license to operate, and they treat it as a good thing. And this is what they're trying to protect by creating these groups. So what is the function of agriculture front groups? They put together materials, they run campaigns, they do various outreach things. And what they're trying to do is, through these materials, to distract the public from the actual evidence of the harms of conventional industrial agriculture, including animal welfare practices. So that would be things like undercover investigations and informational material and all the things that we as advocates try to get out to the public. And they try to replace all of these negative images with positive images. So all the materials that they put out, they try and massage facts, create good news stories, positive images about agriculture. And basically to try to convince the public that there are no problems with the agri-food system. The status quo is fine. There's really nothing that needs to be changed. And this is, of course, what probably you and I would describe as propaganda, and not so much education as indoctrination, getting people to accept a concept rather than understanding actual facts and thinking about them. And the tactics that agriculture front groups use are well established. They borrow the playbook from other controversial industries that have already had decades behind them of using these kinds of disinformation tactics to convince the public that that there are no problems in the industry. Primarily the fossil fuel industry and the tobacco industry, and a lot of studies now have been produced about both of these industries and the kinds of PR and propaganda tactics that they use. And so now I'm just going to touch on three main front groups in Canada, agriculture front groups, and you may be familiar with some of them. One is Farm and Food Care, and its role is primarily to target consumers. So it does public events for consumers, just the general public. There's also agriculture in the classroom, and they specifically target school children. So they produce materials to put into schools and try to reach young children with these kinds of the kind of materials that they produce. And there's also the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. Whoops, sorry, my slides seem to be jumping ahead. And the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity doesn't do an awful lot of public outreach. It focuses more on trying to reach industry groups like retailers, commodity groups, trying to get them to buy into the messaging that they're developing. And they also work a lot with governments to try and get government buy-in for all of this. And you've probably seen the kind of material that they put out. And it's, even though they use the same tactics as false advertising, it's not really the same as false advertising, because they're not trying to sell a specific product. They're not trying to sell you Burn Bray eggs, or they're not trying to sell you a product or a commodity. They're trying to sell you the concept of agriculture as a whole and the idea that it is good. So they put out things like, in the bottom left corner there's an example of one of their campaigns, a farm to table campaign, which is quite a popular thing for these groups to do, to try and get people to try and explain the whole process of food from farm to your plate. And of course, they always leave out the slaughter, and they leave out all the bad things. But it's a popular tactic to use to try and convince people that they have a better understanding of where food comes from. And there are a few other examples here of the sorts of things they do in the top right-hand corner there. That's an example of a farm event, which they often have during the summer, inviting the public to come and visit a farm. And it's all highly sanitized and entertaining, and it's not particularly informative. So these are just, they're pretty standard. These are the usual sorts of things that agriculture front groups do. So I want to just look at a couple of examples just to give you a little more of an idea of how these things play out. So this is a program that was put together by Farm and Food Care and Agriculture in the Classroom called Meals from the Farm. And it was developed to go into schools for young kids and teach them specifically about where their food comes from. And so what they did was they provided kids with a free lunch. And the free lunch consisted of a hot egg and bacon sandwich on an English muffin, carton of milk, oat bar, beef jerky, and a lentil snack. Not a lot of fruits and vegetables in there. And I think you can see which industries are dominating this kind of thing. And they also gave the kids a little activity booklet or some activities to do and a little grab bag and stuff. And on the right, you can see this was actually on Farm and Food Care's website, and it was a promo for this program. And you can see that what they're actually giving the kids is a Tim Hortons egg sandwich on an English muffin. And I don't know about you, but I don't really think that teaches kids an awful lot about where their food comes from. And the whole thing is dominated by which commodity groups were sponsoring this event. And you can tell who was sponsoring it. It was the egg industry, pork industry, and the dairy industry were largely sponsoring this. This is another example of the kind of materials that Farm and Food Care sometimes produces for children. This is actually a coloring book, which I picked up at one of these groups' events last year. And I'm not sure what it's meant to teach kids other than to do exactly what they accuse animal activists of doing, which is anthropomorphizing animals and confusing the public about how to think about animals. But it's the usual approach to animals that is shown to children. And the picture on the picture on the left is the front cover of the coloring book. The picture on the right is one of the pages in the coloring book, and it purports to give little informational things in there. And on this particular page, the information is explaining the difference between brown and white eggs. For some bizarre reason, it's accompanied by a cow pushing a shopping cart full of milk cartons and an egg pushing a shopping cart full of eggs. And again, I don't think this teaches kids an awful lot about anything, let alone where their food comes from. One more example I want to give you, which is a little bit more detailed, of the kind of materials that they produce for children. And this is material that is getting directly into classrooms and being given to teachers. And it's called The Real Dirt on Farming in the Classroom. And The Real Dirt on Farming is actually a booklet that Farm and Food Care produces every 4 years. And it's a glossy booklet with lots of feel-good images about agriculture. And it's meant to answer questions about agriculture, explain to people about where food comes from and all the usual sorts of things. And you may have come across it. They put it in newspapers. It's usually in the Globe and Mail, and it gets distributed through various ways. So what they did was they created this program around the Real Dirt on Farming for children. And they give, as part of this package, they give the teachers the Real Dirt on Farming, the brochure, and these what are called snap ag information sheets, which are created by this other group, Agriculture in the Classroom. And these information sheets are pretty much just infographics about hot topic issues in agriculture. And they give these materials, they have the children read these materials, and then they give assignments to the children to create that are designed to reflect the messaging that is in the materials that they've been given. And this is the one of the lessons that's in this package, and it's called "What's Up with Animal Welfare." And the children are assigned parts of the Farm and Food Care's Real Dirt on Farming brochure. The parts are, there's a section on farm animals, and there's a section on humane treatment of farm animals. And in these sections, you've got a bit here about animal welfare and animal rights. What's the difference? And there's another section on farm trespassing and undercover operations, which we know is all about ag, which sounds to me like very high-level information to be expecting children to absorb. And it really, again, doesn't have anything to do with where food comes from. They're also given this material on the right. These are the Agriculture in the Classroom infographics. And there's one called The Myth of Factory Farms. Another one, welfare rights, what's the difference? Another one on biosecurity. So the kids are given this information to read, and then they're given, I'm sorry, this is a terrible slide. I couldn't actually get this any smaller, so I apologize for this, but these are the assignments that the children are then given. And the first assignment is to imagine a scenario, to imagine they're a Canadian farmer who raises animals, and you're being criticized on social media for inhumane treatment of your animals and for using antibiotics. And you're getting comments like, that's disgusting, and your farm is like a factory farm, and encouraging people not to buy your products. So the assignment is read the materials and then write how you would respond to these comments on social media. And the other assignment is to read the materials, define animal welfare, define animal rights, and then provide an explanation of the role of welfare versus rights on your farm. And there's a little note down there in the bottom right corner, a little note to the teacher to remind the children to use the materials to write their answers and not rely on emotion. Again, this kind of material is getting into schools and being provided to teachers and being provided to children. And needless to say, not only is this doing nothing to teach anybody about where food comes from, it's got a very clear agenda, and it's brainwashing. It's not education. So looking at this kind of material, you may ask yourself, what do front groups actually think of the public? What is their attitude towards we the public, who they need to have on board? And in my experience, they do not have a lot of respect for the public. And they have done a lot of work through surveys and polls and hiring groups to help them with this, to identify specific target audiences so that they can tailor specific messages to those audiences that are going to be the most the most effective to that particular audience. And the key audience that they have identified is, I don't know if they use this term anymore, but they used to refer to it as crunchy mamas. And this target audience is identified by being female, and female because women do make the majority of purchases and they tend to be responsible for children. So they've identified that as a key target audience. They are urban, they're middle class, they know little or nothing about agriculture, they're emotional. And by emotional, what they're referring to is that they're easily susceptible to disturbing images, like images of animals suffering. And excuse me, and they're fickle. They're always bouncing around from one thing to another, like wanting organic or wanting this or wanting that. And so that is their main target audience. They do have other ones, but this has traditionally been their main target audience. And this target audience actually comes up sometimes in materials. This is actually from a agriculture trade magazine called The Western Producer, which is based in Winnipeg. And they often have articles in this magazine. They often have articles about public trust in consumers and how difficult consumers are. And they're often accompanied by these cartoons. And the one on the left, this is your traditional crunchy mama. She also seems to be having a bit of an angry Karen moment in there as well. But this is pretty much sums up one of the key target audiences that they are developing messages for. An urban middle-class woman who doesn't approve of anything, is angry, thinks they know everything, and you've got the poor, hard-done-by farmer on the right who just has to take it. The picture on the right is an article that was in the Western Producer last year, and it was an article about fickle consumer fads, and I think the image speaks for itself. Farmers, the dilemma of farmers always having to change what they're doing because they have to respond to fickle and basically annoying consumers. So not an awful lot of respect, I think, generally across the board for the public. You might think that they have a different attitude towards farmers who they profess to be working for. And I tend to think that they don't really have an awful lot of respect for individual farmers either. And this is the most egregious example that I have come across of that. And this is, you may remember Percy Schmeiser, who was a Saskatchewan farmer, canola farmer, if I remember. And he was sued in, was it 1998, by Monsanto for having Monsanto's Roundup seed growing in his fields. And Monsanto argued that they had a patent on the seed, and Schmeiser had not. It had not been approved for Schmeiser to grow it, and in the end, it was long and complicated. In the end, Monsanto sued Schmeiser for having the seed in his fields, and Monsanto won. Not because the court found that Schmeiser had done anything particularly bad, but the issue was more the patent, that Monsanto did have a right to have a patent on this seed. They did not award anything to Monsanto, and they actually ordered that Monsanto pay to get the stuff out of Schmeiser's field. After this happened, Schmeiser became a big farmers' rights activist. He won a lot of awards. And a few years later, there was a movie about it. Percy, you may have seen it. It was starred Christopher Walken. So I tell you this story because just before the movie came out about Percy, one of these front groups, the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, issued an internal advisory to its membership. And its membership consists of industry commodity groups and corporations and retailers, grocers. And so it issued this internal advisory to its membership to let them know that the movie was about to come out and that its membership might be contacted by the media to talk about this movie. And it provided them with key messaging on what to say if the media asked them about this. And this is what the key messaging included. These are things that they said the industry could talk about if contacted by the media. To remind the media that Percy Schmeiser lost in court and Monsanto won, as though that made everything okay. To mention that these patent cases, in particular, they're referring to Monsanto's patent on this seed. It was called Roundup seed. That patent cases have helped the industry, that they're a good thing. That agriculture companies have invested billions annually in doing all kinds of great things. That farmers have control over what they grow. The implication being that Schmeiser could have controlled what was growing in his field, even though he couldn't really because of the circumstances. That GMOs are good, and that modern technology does all kinds of wonderful things like decreasing greenhouse gas emissions and creating a great food system. So basically what they were doing here was helping their membership help Monsanto with damage control and pretty much throwing Percy Schmeiser under the bus. They should have been working for the farmer. Instead, they were working for Monsanto, which I should mention is a big funder of all of these front groups, sits on the board. Monsanto has since been bought out by Bayer, but all of these kinds of organizations fund these groups, sit on their boards, sponsor their events. They're heavily involved in these front groups. That's not to say that they don't have anything to do with farmers. Farmers are actually very useful to them in being spokespeople. They do like to use farmers, particularly photogenic ones with very nice looking farms, to be the spokespeople for the front groups. And in order to make this effective, they will often provide farmer training. And this is an example of farmer training that Farm and Food Care provides, their Speak Up training program. And this one, I actually attended this one. It was hosted by Farm and Food Care in 2022. And it was the speaker was Kelly Daynard, who is the executive director of Farm and Food Care. And these kinds of events don't train farmers how to explain things like NFAT codes or particular practices that are used in agriculture or the regulatory system in Canada or what kind of oversight there is, anything like that. It's all teaching farmers public relations, how to talk to the public, how to steer them away from difficult things, how to get them focused on good news stories, how to make them feel like farmers have shared values with them, all of this kind of stuff. So at this particular talk that I attended, and it's it's typical of all of their talks. Kelly Daynard, one of the things that she recommended to attendees was to avoid terms that are going to make the public uncomfortable. And she mentioned specifically terms like debeaking. Don't use the word crates, say group housing instead. And certainly don't use the word factory farm. And she also advised that when farmers talk to the public, that first of all, they get a sense of the person they're talking to and ask yourself, do they agree with my ethical right to grow food? I don't think that's a question, but that seems to be the baseline for how far they should be willing to engage with the public. And she said, definitely don't debate with activists and stay away from extreme activists. And in this talk, she provided an example of some extreme activists that the industry should stay away from. And you probably recognize these people. On the left there, you've got Joaquin Phoenix. In the middle there, you've got Camille Labchuk, who is the executive director of Animal Justice. And for some bizarre reason that nobody can figure out, on the right there, you've got Gwyneth Paltrow, who, as far as I know, has not done anything for animals. And as well as presenting activists and animal advocates in this way, in how in the material that they share with their farmers and their warnings, they also actually track activists and animal advocates. And some of it's pretty egregious and some of it's a bit more benign. And here's an example of a more benign case of that. This was from a newsletter in 2023 from the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. And this is sent out to their members. They had a little section called What Media is Saying, and they just include items that are in the media about agriculture. But in this particular one, they let their members know that Animal Justice Academy was hosting a lunchtime live panel called Training in Corporate Pressure Campaigns. And you can see on the bottom there, they informed their members that this is a video that provides insights into the tactics used by animal activists, such as Animal Justice, to exert pressure on businesses and corporations. Not really a bad thing. So that is a pretty quick romp through Canadian agriculture front groups, and hopefully we can get into a bit more detail later. But just to sum up, just to again hit home the main points that I hope you'll take away is to keep in mind that these front groups represent corporal, industrial, and conventional interests. They don't represent everyone in agriculture, and not everyone who works in agriculture supports these front groups, and some of them are adamantly opposed to them. And that tends to be individual farmers, people operating small farms, alternative farming. So there is quite a divide between people working on the ground and these corporate front groups. These groups have borrowed tactics from fossil fuels and tobacco industries. They've just straight off adopted their playbook. They work to maintain the industry's self-regulated status, what they refer to as social license. Their purpose is not to inform and educate, but to secure public acceptance of industry practices and the agri-food system, what they refer to as public trust in agriculture. And something that I didn't get into, but perhaps we can talk a little bit about later, is that these groups receive millions and millions of dollars in public funding from federal and provincial governments for all of this public relations and marketing that they are producing. And I think the most important point for us to be aware of is that animal advocates can play a key role in challenging these agriculture front groups and the propaganda that they produce. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Wow. So some of the comments I just want to share with you that were coming in during your talk. Terry said, and they call us propagandist. Carrie said, amazing research you have done. Thank you. It is scary, but I'm glad to know about it. Michelle said, thank you so much, Elizabeth. This was enlightening and frustrating. Yes, absolutely. you know, I don't know, like, I knew, I kind of had a feeling that people would really blow their lids as far as the agriculture in the classroom program. And I just really want to point out, folks, they get government money to brainwash Canadian children. Government money. So, yeah, how do they get this funding? Yeah. So, Elizabeth, one thing I just want to ask, and we don't have a lot of time because we need to move into the next ones. Animal justice has been trying to get government policy to recognize very basic protections for farmed animals, but we get so much pushback from political parties. Do these front groups influence government and policy as well?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. And it really took off them trying to do that in the early 2010s, which is when Farm and Food Care, and then not too long after that, the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity was created. Oh, and actually Ag in the Classroom Canada. And they really made it their job to try and lobby. I shouldn't say lobby because these are registered charities, but influence government to adopt the public trust concept. They worked really hard to convince politicians, and particularly agriculture ministers, that governments should be investing in these campaigns that secure public trust. Because if they didn't, there's an economic risk to the industry, and that's not good for government. And so they've used that approach to try and get governments on board, that this is actually good for the agriculture industry as a whole, to put out these public trust campaigns to keep the public happy. They don't quite phrase it that way, but they present it in a way that it's appealing to governments as well as to the industry. And it's like lightning. The governments just jumped right on board with this, and now it's quite ingrained in policy, and they are getting a lot of money to do this.
Elizabeth, thank you. It's we'll hear a little bit more how this goes sort of hand in hand when we have Tayler speak to us. But I think we have a lot of a lot of people going, I had no idea it was this bad. PJ, how about we get you up to, a lot of people are very curious about the degree to which Big Ag is using disinformation campaigns to protect the industry. So take it away.
All right, sounds good. Just give me a moment to pull up my slides.
And thank you so much, Elizabeth, by the way.
All right, and sorry, I realized my URL bar is showing, not able to change that, but hopefully the slides are still big enough that everyone can follow along.
We'll forgive you because you're so kind, PJ.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm the corporate engagement manager with Animal Justice, and I've been working very closely with Elizabeth on the forthcoming report, which is a really deep dive into all of these topics. And I'm going to focus on the industry misinformation tactics directed at food companies and how front groups are influencing animal welfare policy in Canada. So a little bit moving away from the influence on consumers and more moving toward how they're influencing the industry itself and companies, which then sell food to Canadians. So I first became aware of this issue of industry influence on corporate animal welfare policy when I was starting to reach out to companies about fulfilling their animal welfare commitments starting in 2020. And in this process, I noticed that the companies that were doing poorly, companies that had, say, committed to banning intensive confinement, like cages for hens or crates for mother pigs, and their supply chains, when companies were doing poorly, they often said the same things. They often had the same talking points about why they were backtracking. And one of the reasons that they often cited was reliance on the National Farm Animal Care Council, or NFAC, which is an industry-dominated body that creates guidelines for farms, which importantly, they're not legally binding standards, they're not enforceable, there's no oversight and compliance. Many of you may have seen more information about NFAC recently in our new website that we launched last month, nfacts.ca. And I also saw in this process of following up with companies on their policies, extreme industry consolidation. So Canada has only 2 major egg producers. We have 2 grocery companies that own 50% of the market, and they're all working together with NFAC. And thirdly, while I was starting to reach out to companies about their policies within 3 months, we also saw this major development from the Retail Council of Canada, also known as the RCC. And I want to highlight these NFAC and the RCC quite a bit because even though these are sort of obscure acronyms, many people don't know who these groups are. They are very critical players when it comes to holding back animal welfare progress in Canada. So that's why I wanted to highlight these. The RCC backtracked on their commitments for grocery stores in Canada, the commitments to ban cages and ban crates. And this was despite, a decade of these companies talking about their leadership role for animal welfare and in phasing out extremely cruel practices. So this move from the RCC left retailers to independently come up with their own sourcing commitments. And through this, basically the retailers stopped making animal welfare progress entirely while citing NFAC. And this is all going to connect to front groups in a moment, because it turns out the influence of these groups was very key in some of this backtracking, which I'll unpack some of the details of how that's happened. So, as working with NFAC started to become synonymous with backtracking or making no progress in animal welfare, I wanted to see how the front group agenda may have infiltrated Canada's animal welfare framework. And what I found was a pretty obvious shift from 2017 to 2021. And this is the time when the US Center for Food Integrity brought its approach to Canada, created the Canadian Center for Food Integrity, and successfully convinced industry and government that public trust was a key concern for agriculture in Canada. So before this happened, we saw that NFAC would release a report every year that was called, as you can see on the slide, Market Relevant Codes and Communication Leadership. Not really a very interesting title, probably not really designed for the public. But in this report for the very first time, they had a section called Preserving Public Trust, and they called public trust the new buzzword. And importantly, in this report for the very first time, the National Farm Animal Care Council was claiming that it itself was, quote, critical for maintaining public trust in how farmers care for their animals. And I see this as particularly concerning for animal advocates because when positive public perception becomes the mandate of the body that sets animal welfare baselines, that body has an interest in painting the status quo as positive. So how are they going to publicly acknowledge shortcomings? How are they going to justify updating standards if supposedly the existing standards are already good enough? So we start to see NFAC's mandate shift toward being concerned about public trust as well, which becomes very clear when their next report in 2021 actually has this in the title. The title of their annual report is now Advancing Animal Welfare and Public Trust Through the Codes of Practice. So this organization now receives government funding, not only to develop codes for the industry, but also to market itself as a good process, even if that process is producing standards that fall behind Canada's peer countries. So it may not come as a surprise to learn that we're now seeing increasing overlap between members of NFAC and members of Canada's most influential agriculture front group, the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. Here's a list of the members of both. So today, more than a third of NFAC's primary and voting members are also members of the agricultural front group, the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. NFAC even goes so far as to recommend the activist surveillance group, Animal Agriculture Alliance, on its membership page. So who are these groups that are from industry, that are members of both organizations? How are they being influenced by the front group agenda? So these are some of the industry groups that are members of both. They are largely what are called marketing agencies, but they have a sort of official status that I'll describe a little bit. Compared to front groups, these kinds of groups operate very more covertly. Compared to front groups that operate covertly, these groups operate more in the open. So they are clearly representing the economic interests of an industry, but that also means they're more susceptible to public scrutiny. So there was, for example, a 2023 Research Co survey that found that these kinds of industry groups are among the least trusted to Canadians relative to animal protection organizations or government. And this kind of helps explain their name and their marketing approach. These groups were not always named this. So interestingly, When they were created in the 1970s, they were created by government proclamation by names that actually describe what they do. These groups are technically the Canadian Egg Marketing Agency and the Canadian Chicken Marketing Agency. They changed their names in the 90s and 2000s to portray themselves as a collection of farmers, which research shows are one of the most trusted groups among Canadians. So a little bit more about these groups and their marketing. So this is kind of how they portray themselves. They portray themselves as though they are multi-generational families. They have images of families in front of barns or an open land. The reality is these are corporate and administrative bodies. They're primarily staffed by professional lobbyists, economists, communications experts. They portray themselves as being farmer-run, when the reality is even though their boards usually maintain a majority that represent producers, that doesn't necessarily mean actual farmers. Today's agricultural producers include big agribusinesses, and the remaining board members are from the processing and food service sectors, and their staff are largely administrative and marketing professionals. They also portray themselves as almost like a wholesome association of peers. The reality is that by definition, they function like a legal version of a cartel. They are granted power by statutory, they are granted power and statutory authority through government proclamation. A farmer can't sell like chicken commercially in Canada without paying mandatory fees to these agencies. These agencies set prices, they limit competition. So they function like a legal cartel would. So let's take a look at a few of their compelling examples of marketing. So over time, these groups have become more savvy in their communications. They rarely mention activists, but when they do, I think it's worth looking at. So I have a couple examples I've noted over the years of when they mention activists. So the first here, and I realize this text is small, but you can look up this document if you'd like. It's from 2017 from Chicken Farmers of Canada and from the Canadian Poultry and Egg Processors Council. It's a resource called Know the Facts. Recent vegan activist claims are misleading and misguided. And this followed 5 years of undercover investigations of Canadian farms by Mercy for Animals. Then in 2021, Chicken Farmers of Canada put out a series of ads in Canadian Grocer magazine directed at food companies. This also followed mostly me emailing companies about their animal welfare policies, and they put out ads that say supporting you through animal activist activities. And what's particularly funny about this one to me is that these are Mercy for Animals brand colors. This is not the brand colors of the Chicken Farmers of Canada who put out this ad. Their brand colors are red and white, and this is the only thing I've ever seen from them where they used this orange and blue color scheme, which is Mercy for Animals brand colors, which was the organization I was working with at the time doing this outreach to companies to try to see how they were doing on animal welfare. Anyway, so both of these examples were really attempts to deflect from investigation findings or from corporate accountability efforts. They try to cast the industry as the victim. And this is also a really striking example of a tactic that some of you may have heard before that's known as DARVO, stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. It's a pretty useful framework for analyzing propaganda. So that's part of why I'm sharing it with you all here. The model was initially developed by a psychologist, Dr. Jennifer Freyd, in the late 90s. It was meant to address interpersonal abuse dynamics, but today it's also commonly used as a framework for understanding propaganda, basically understanding how those in power deflect accountability by labeling advocates as the aggressors or labeling advocates or critics as the purveyors of misinformation. So we can look at that first resource noted here and just like do a quick analysis with this framework. I think this is kind of useful for when you see industry propaganda to do this kind of thing. So this is just an excerpt here from the 2017 resource. And what they do here, the industry group, is they effectively deny well-documented welfare concerns by labeling them as misleading and misguided. They state that it's the commitment of their Canadian chicken partners that's being targeted, effectively denying that investigations have found systemic animal suffering. They go on the attack. They shift the focus from farming practices that have been criticized to the character of their critics. They frame the critics as being motivated by covert and harmful interests like, quote, destroying the livelihoods of Canada's farmers. So the industry is attempting to discredit evidence without actually addressing any substance of the criticisms. And then they are reversing the victim and offender. They're basically the multi-billion-dollar for-profit industry is portraying itself as the victim of misinformation and, quote, extortion tactics, casting advocates as the aggressors and the industry in need of protection. So this strategy is very obvious. Industry marketing has gotten smarter. They mostly now rely on positive messaging. And we see this from Burnbrae Farms, which is Canada's biggest egg producer. They did this, they've done this repeatedly as they've come under fire from advocates for continuing to use really cruel cages on their farms. So right after Mercy for Animals and Animal Justice launched campaigns focused on Burnbrae in 2024, literally the day after Mercy for Animals campaign was launched, Burnbrae published 8 blogs in a row. They've continued to republish these over and over again, and they include titles like Outstanding Hen Care and Our Commitment to Consumer Choice, the Right Thing to Do, and Why Do Specialty Eggs Like Cage-Free Cost More? And also, interestingly, in the same year, the company's CEO spoke at the U.S. Center for Integrity's annual summit in a talk about navigating crises and activist challenges. So another area of propaganda to go into. So we've got, they will attack activists, they will just put out positive information that's relatively meaningless. And then another thing that they do to gain public trust and market themselves and kind of convince food companies that the status quo is adequate is their own assurance programs. So these are programs that you may have seen. You may see these on products. They show up in their ads. They're examples like Raised by a Canadian Farmer. That's a chicken program. A dairy program called ProAction. You'll also see that 100% Canadian milk stamp. That's, I think, connected to ProAction. And then there's the Egg Farmers of Canada's Egg Quality Assurance Program. And when you go through these assurance programs communications, they really overemphasize certain words. They often use terms like rigorous, strict, robust, stringent, world-class. They're always trying to appear highly regulated. But what they're actually doing is framing the baseline as premium. They're putting their own stamp on it, which is just stamping the conditions that already exist, which are what we're critiquing in the first place. They also do a few particular marketing tricks. A really common one is appealing to national pride. So Raised by a Canadian Farmer, the stamp of 100% Canadian milk. But what most consumers probably don't realize, which is why they do this, is that Canada's chicken, dairy, and egg industries are closed markets. They're under a system called supply management. They have very low import rates. So basically, almost all of the chicken and dairy sold in Canada is from Canada. So it doesn't really mean anything to put the stamp on it, but by doing that, they give it a sort of premium status and make it appear more regulated than it is. And unfortunately, these programs have been persuasive. They're increasingly used to assure food companies that had their own standards that exceeded the baseline that industry provides. They're increasingly influencing these food companies to think that industry-led standards are sufficient. And so companies are dropping their own commitments and saying, well, we just source from, this stamp of approval, which is, from the industry itself. And so all of this is really allowing corporate animal welfare policy in Canada to be undermined, allowing companies to basically outsource their own commitments to industry. And that's putting Canadian companies increasingly at odds with global animal welfare standards. And we can see an example of this here. So this is a standard global corporate animal welfare policy. And I just want you to see gradually how a Canadian version becomes diminished through industry influence. So here, this is a standard commitment to source something like 100% cage-free eggs by a certain time. There are over 2,600 companies around the world with this exact kind of policy, and there are over 130 in Canada. And you can see here that when Canadian companies initially adopted their own policies, we see here an example from Sobeys and MTY Group, which is a major restaurant company. They had policies that really matched the global standard. This is how most corporate responsibility commitments go. It's not only for animal welfare. Typically, they need to be specific and time-bound. But when it came time to fulfill these commitments and these companies were not making progress and started to be, critiqued by advocates or started to see, protests and public awareness campaigns drawing attention to it, they backtracked. And what we see here is exactly how they did it. And it's using the things that we've now talked about. So they mention NFAC. They sometimes mention industry associations or assurance programs. We see their MTY group mentioning the Egg Quality Assurance Program. And they'll frame current practices as though they're their own policy. So for example, even though the Canadian egg industry is already moving to enrich cages, these companies are now framing it as though that's their policy to move to these cages, while carefully not even saying the word cage. I added cage in here in square brackets so that it would be clear what we're talking about, but they do not do that anymore. So they're conveniently pulling out the word cage, referencing industry standards as though this is their own policy. So to conclude, I'm going to just go over quickly the other talking points that they tend to use when they do this kind of backtracking, because this is what they do in their policies, but they also tend to use the same talking points when they do it. And these become more obvious the more of these corporate policies you look at and the kinds of statements they give to media. So one thing that they do that's really common is they try to diffuse responsibility or kind of hiding with this industry shield. So they reference industry-wide commitments to help any one actor from being singled out. So as an example, Walmart says this, quote, Walmart was among a wave of at least 230 companies, and then they proceed to backtrack in what follows. Another one, Metro's industry commitments through the Retail Council of Canada, and then they proceed to backtrack from there. So that's a really common one. Another one that they do is this sort of complexity pivot where they frame the failure to meet an animal welfare policy not as a lack of will or values, but as a feasibility issue. So as an example, this is from Sobeys, quote, everyone in our industry at every step of the supply chain has a role to play in ensuring our animal products are sourced respectfully. Since the retailers made these commitments, we've learned that the supply chain needs more time to adapt. And that's sort of true. They do need a little more time than they initially thought. But that statement is also followed by 5 years of making absolutely no progress. So they're saying something like, well, we just need more time. It's everyone's responsibility, and then actually doing nothing. So it's no one company's fault, and it's just going to take more time, but we're never going to say how long or make any progress along the way. Another really common one, and this one comes from Big Tobacco, very commonly used in the 1970s, is the illusion of consumer choice. So they'll do things like frame continuing to sell eggs from caged hens as a positive decision to provide consumers with more choice. And this whole personal choice argument for PR purposes for troubled industries was really popularized by Big Tobacco in the 1970s. We see this from Sobeys as well. Quote, Sobeys says, we recognize that affordable food choices remain critically important to our consumers. We believe in providing customers with a choice so they can make decisions that are right for their households. And I think really if we were to say this in the more obvious way, we recognize that giving customers the choice to buy eggs from caged hens is critically important, it sounds pretty weird. Or if we were to say something like, we believe it's critically important for our customers to have the choice to buy chocolate produced with abusive labor practices. It sounds ridiculous, but when they just say it as we want to give consumers a choice, it sounds positive. So there's a lot of these kind of subtle things that they do when they're backtracking. Another one they do is this distraction of meaningless data. So they'll do things like report the percentage of cage-free egg sales every year. But if you are like me and you look at the report every year, you see that they're reporting 17% every single year for 5 years in a row. So it looks like there's some kind of progress happening, but there's no year-over-year progress. Another thing they'll do is report how many of their stores sell cage-free eggs, which is completely meaningless. That's not part of any corporate animal welfare policy. So it's kind of distracting data that's relatively meaningless. And then the last thing that's common is they won't say the word cage. So that we see this in the example of the policies diminishing over time, they will not say cage wherever possible. So they'll say housing, barns, systems. They'll say enriched colony housing is a common one you see, and that's just a cage that's very similar to a conventional battery cage. So that's another common thing that they do. So what do we do? very quickly. We'll give you a lot more of this later when we release our report. But what we're really trying to do right now is identify and expose. That's the stage that we're at with these groups. The influence of these groups does pose a major challenge to farm animal advocacy, but the good news is that for them, the truth is a PR problem. Right. So we are in an era right now of a lot of pushback against the gains that we've seen in the US and Canada. We did break through the public in the 2010s with undercover investigations. We successfully secured new corporate policies, passed legislation. And now our view is to undermine some of the sources of that backlash. We need to publicly identify and expose these groups. Here, that means clearly showing the public, activists, journalists, government, how Canadian agriculture has imported this US front group approach to undermining animal welfare regulation. And we also need to work to get stronger regulation here at the same time. So that's it for me for now, but we will be back with more actions for you later. Thank you.
Thank you, PJ. Wow, that freedom of choice argument is probably just prime for right now in the political environment. So unbelievable. And now, PJ, I have questions, but I'm going to leave them until the end just so that we can get going with Tayler's presentation, because this is something that what she's going to share is something that every animal advocate should pay attention to. So all the scary things Big Ag is doing to repress and intimidate activists fighting for animal protection. So Tayler, please do share.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Happy to be here. As was mentioned, I'm the Advocacy Program Specialist at Animal Justice, and I'm going to finish off the panel with the activism component. So it's going to be focusing on how the animal agriculture industry has shifted the narrative about activists and how these narratives have contributed to the repression and criminalization of animal activism in Canada. So part of what I'm going to be talking about tonight draws from my recent dissertation research, which explored how animal activists in Canada are targeted and criminalized when their advocacy threatens the interest of what scholars often refer to as the animal industrial complex. And this is the interconnected system of corporate agriculture, political influence and institutions, legal systems, economic interests that all rely on the exploitation of animals and ultimately uphold one another. And what my research ultimately demonstrates is that the repression of animal activists is not isolated, it is not random, but deeply structural. Government institutions, industry organizations, media actors, and law enforcement are frequently operating in alignment with one another to suppress forms of activism that threaten the dominant political and economic status quo. So my work builds on a really broad body of scholarship that examines repression within social movements sort of more generally. Some of the existing research has shown that repression affects movements not only structurally through things like policing and legal restrictions, but also like emotionally and psychologically at the level of the individual activist as well. So studies from, the United Kingdom, the United States have documented a really long history of surveillance, of undercover infiltration, of strategic lawsuits, things like aggressive policing, and the use of terrorism rhetoric against animal activists. And in both of these countries, activists have repeatedly been portrayed as extremists or threats to public safety, despite the overwhelming non-violent nature of the movement. And so when we look at Canada in this context, what makes Canada really interesting is its reputation typically for being more progressive, more tolerant, sort of rights-oriented. There is often an assumption that Canada operates differently from the United States when it comes to things like policing dissent. But my research found that, beneath this image, Canada has employed many of the same punitive tactics that are used elsewhere to silence activists and to try and protect industry interests. And despite this, the repression of the animal rights movement in Canada remains relatively understudied, particularly the relationship between the ideological repression of the movement. So, ideological meaning the narratives and the discourses used to delegitimize activists, and then the more material forms of repression. So, that would be things like surveillance, criminal charges, and legislation. So my research was situated in three different research questions, but the question most relevant for this conversation was how have government, industry, and media institutions in Canada historically responded to the threat animal activists pose to the status quo? And what emerged from this research was a remarkably consistent pattern. Repression of the animal rights movement in Canada has been systematic, it's been coordinated, and it's been heavily influenced by strategies developed in the United Kingdom and the United States. Government institutions and animal agriculture industries, like I said, have been repeatedly collaborating to try and delegitimize activists and to suppress any sort of dissent through both of these ideological and material means. And more specifically, my research revealed four major forms of repression that are being used against animal activists in Canada. One is discrediting activists through industry-driven narratives and media framing. The second is surveillance and harassment by both private industry actors as well as law enforcement. The third is the use of lawsuits and criminal charges to punish and deter activism. And then finally, you've got legislative repression through measures such as ag-gag laws. And when we look at these together, these findings show how ideological narratives produced by the agriculture industry helped create the conditions for increasingly institutionalized and material forms of repression. So one of the most important findings from my research was the central role of discrediting. So before surveillance, criminalization, or restrictive legislation can be justified, activists first have to be constructed as socially dangerous. And what my research found is that the animal agriculture industry played and plays a central role in producing and circulating this type of ideology. And mainstream media often reproduces and amplifies these specific narratives. So through my work, I found that across various industry statements and media coverage, I found a very consistent discourse that was being used to describe animal activists. So activists were repeatedly labeled as violent, as extremists, as militants, as criminals, and oftentimes even terrorists. And their actions were framed as being threats to the public order, threats to economic stability, threats to biosecurity, and threats to even national security. And what's important to look at here is that these narratives were not initially generated by law enforcement or government institutions alone. Industry actors themselves were often the primary drivers of this framing. So agricultural organizations, trade and front groups, commodity groups, corporate representatives, they were repeatedly characterizing activists as dangerous, as irrational, whose actions threatened not only businesses, but farmers, families, and the public more broadly. And these portrayals were then reproduced through mainstream media reporting, which you can see here, which frequently adopted industry language and assumptions with very little, if any, critical scrutiny. So media reporting frequently emphasized things like fear, danger, extremism. And this helped to construct activists as public threats rather than, political actors who were raising legitimate ethical concerns about the systemic violence against animals. And over time, these narratives then became increasingly institutionalized. And then we saw government agencies began reproducing many of the same claims that had been circulated by industry groups and by media outlets. So one example in the 1990s, late 1990s, internal documents from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, characterized animal activists as political terrorists and warned of the possibility of quote unquote serious violence and activists quote unquote claiming lives. These claims are particularly striking given that no animal rights activist in Canada or elsewhere has ever killed a human being as part of their activism. And so to understand this process, I drew on Stanley Cohen's concept of the moral panic. So Cohen argued that moral panics occur when a group is portrayed as a threat to societal values and interests through exaggerated, sensationalized, and highly publicized narratives that generate fear and anxiety within the broader public. And then media and institutional actors play a central role in amplifying these narratives and framing these specific groups as dangerous social threats, requiring intervention and some sort of control. And so this framework really helps explain how the animal agriculture industry strategically contributed to the construction of a moral panic around animal activism. So through these repeated messages about extremism and violence, trespassing, things like threats to public safety, industry groups cultivated a very specific narrative that framed activists as dangerous outsiders rather than legitimate political actors. And then mainstream media, as we saw, then amplified and normalized these claims, which helped transform these industry narratives into like a broader public common sense. So these moral panics do not simply generate fear, but they also legitimize repression. So once activists are successfully framed as these dangerous extremists, then more aggressive forms of policing, of surveillance, of legal restriction begin to appear like reasonable and necessary as a response. So the ideological narrative itself creates the conditions that make the material repression possible. So this ideological groundwork really ultimately paved the way for the more concrete forms of repression that we've seen. So surveillance, aggressive policing, lawsuits, criminal charges, and eventual legislation like ag laws. So, in that sense, the repression of animal activists did not begin with arrests or with legislation. It began with the strategic production of narratives designed to delegitimize dissent, to, protect industry legitimacy and try and normalize punitive responses to activism. My research also highlighted the close relationship between industry and policing institutions. So in many cases, police responses to activists appeared deeply intertwined with industry interests and narratives. Activists who engage in protests, in vigils, or investigations talk about frequently encountering disproportionate policing responses, including things like extensive monitoring, intelligence gathering, repeated police contact, and aggressive criminal charging practices. The criminalization of activists frequently occurs in contexts where activists are attempting to expose conditions inside farms, slaughterhouses, or laboratories. And what we've seen is that rather than addressing the underlying concerns being raised, so that being, criminal animal cruelty, institutions are instead focusing attention on the actions of the activists themselves. So this reframing exposure and documentation as criminal threat, right? So back to what PJ was talking about with like the reversal of the victim, this is where we can see that really play out as well. So one example that folks may remember was the Excelsior hog farm case. So after hidden camera footage was leaked from inside the farm showing, very clear and serious animal abuse, the primary response from the institutions, like police, for example, was not centered on investigating the abuse itself or pursuing like criminal accountability against the farm. Instead, the focus shifted towards the break-in and identifying whoever placed the cameras inside the facility. So here we see the industry framing themselves as the victim of activist intrusion, while police efforts concentrated on investigating the exposure of the abuse rather than the abuse that had been exposed. And so in this way, attention was redirected away from questions of animal cruelty and instead toward the criminalization of transparency, right, or documentation. And so this is important because it shows how repression works not only through formal law, but through selective enforcement and institutional priorities. And surveillance also emerged as like a really major theme throughout my research. So the farming industry has a long history of systematically monitoring critics and advocacy organizations. And one example is the Animal Agriculture Alliance, or the AAA, which is a US-based industry organization that's funded by major meat and dairy producers. So the AAA was founded in 1987 and is said to, quote, safeguard the future of animal agriculture. And on its website, it openly advertises that it monitors and tracks animal advocacy activities and campaigns as one of its primary functions. So it tracks advocacy groups, it attends activist events, it monitors social media, it records conferences and meetings, probably like this one, welcome, hello, takes photographs and audio recordings, and builds extensive databases on organizations and specific individuals. So documents obtained through Freedom of Information by the nonprofit Property of the People revealed that the AA maintained profiles on over 150 organizations and more than 2,400 individuals, including activists, lawyers, academics, and advocacy professionals. And this includes animal justice and our staff. And these files tracked not only things like protests and campaigns, but also things like personal relationships, things like legal strategies and organizational planning. So what is significant here is that surveillance is not merely reactive. It is proactive and preventative. So its purpose is not simply to respond to unlawful acts, but to predict, to monitor, and to suppress dissent before it can actually gain traction. And this broader process of ideological and material repression is very visible in the rise of ag legislation. So ag legislation, these laws are designed to restrict transparency and ultimately criminalize undercover investigations into industrial animal agriculture. And they first emerged in the United States as a direct response to undercover investigations exposing cruelty and abuse inside industrial animal farming operations. And these investigations threatened not only the public trust that Elizabeth and PJ have talked about in animal agriculture, but also obviously industry profit, right? And so in response, agricultural lobby groups, front groups, they pushed heavily for legislation that would criminalize unauthorized documentation. It would restrict access to farms, and it would target whistleblowers and investigators. And despite the significant constitutional challenges that these laws faced in the United States, with several courts in various states striking them down based on free speech grounds, Similar legislation began appearing across Canada in 2019. And, importantly, this legislation did not emerge in a vacuum. So my research found that animal agriculture industry organizations, they played a major role in the lobbying for and promoting of ag laws in the country. So industry groups, again, framed activists and undercover investigators as these like dangerous trespassers, biosecurity threats, and risks to farmer safety. And these arguments closely mirrored the ideological narratives that had already been circulating for years through media and political discourse. So, for example, Bill 156, which was Ontario's ag gag law, this was strongly supported by agriculture industry organizations and trade and front groups, which advocated for stronger legal protections against activists and undercover investigations. So supporters claimed the law was necessary to protect farms and biosecurity. Critics, on the other hand, argued that its primary effect was to shield the industry from transparency and public accountability. And in 2024, Animal Justice successfully challenged portions of Bill 156 in court, with an Ontario judge ruling at the time that several provisions of the legislation violated constitutional protections for freedom of expression. The government appealed that decision. And unfortunately, just last week, we received the news that the Ontario Court of Appeal has allowed that appeal to go forward, which, sets a really dangerous precedent when it comes to freedom of expression. So what we ultimately see through ag legislation is the institutionalization of the animal agriculture industry's narrative through the institutionalization of repression. So the ideological narratives portraying activists as extremists or threats becomes translated into formal systems of law. So very uplifting, I know. To conclude, my research really demonstrates that the repression of animal activism in Canada cannot be understood simply as like a series of isolated legal or policing responses. At its core, this repression has been driven by the narratives very strategically constructed and circulated by the animal agriculture industry itself. What is particularly important is, again, that these ideological narratives did not just shape public opinion, but they helped justify and legitimize more material forms of repression. And once activists have been framed in a very specific way, things like surveillance, aggressive policing, lawsuits, criminal charges, ag legislation, these are then presented as reasonable and necessary responses. So in many ways, the industry, succeeded in shifting the public conversation away from the violence and exploitation occurring within industrial animal agriculture and toward the supposed like threat posed by the people who are exposing it. And, cases again, like Excelsior Hog Farm really illustrate that very clearly. And so, ultimately my research shows that the repression of animal activism in Canada has operated in a very coordinated way through industry, media, and state institutions, all working to protect the legitimacy and economic interests of the animal industrial complex. Thank you.
Wow, Tayler. Thank you so much for that. Again, not news we wanted, but news that is so very important. Yeah, people are stunned in the chat. So I know we're coming close to our 8:30 stop time, but I'm hoping that Elizabeth, PJ, and Tayler, you might be willing to stay a few extra minutes to answer some questions. Okay, that would be great. And we thank anybody who has to run. We'll probably just take an extra 10 minutes. If you need to run, please. Thank you for being here. Tayler, first of all, that diagram with the hundreds of threads connecting the different animal protection organizations, I wish we were all that well connected in this movement. Like, I wish.
I know. I think
Wow.
I find that to be some of the funniest and most ironic of some of
Yeah.
the stuff that's being put out by these front groups. Oftentimes too, there's like a real focus on like how much money animal organizations make. And I think, the
Right?
irony around that too is that we're essentially working to put ourselves out of business. Where like the
Yes,
animal
exactly.
the animal agriculture industry is not, right? They
Yeah.
have everything to lose, we have nothing to lose and everything to gain in that. So it's
Yeah.
very interesting to see sort of the rhetoric that they push.
Oh, and absolutely for anybody who was watching the federal ag gag law committee hearings with our Minister of Agriculture, sorry, the critic, John Barlow, always brought up how much money these animal rights organizations in Canada were making. Meanwhile, he was quoting the money from the states. He wasn't even using like we make next to nothing here in Canada, but didn't bother with those kind of totals. So yeah, ridiculous. And one more thing, Taylor, there's an aspect of this that feels particularly raw right now in light of Animal Justice's loss last week at the Ontario Court of Appeal around the Ontario Ag Gag law. That will reinstate some very scary parts of this Ag Gag law. Can you talk a little bit about these and how they've affected, like if they've had a real chilling sort of consequence with animal advocacy in Canada's most populous province?
Yeah, I mean, through my research, I talked to a lot of activists about ag laws specifically and how they felt about whether they would have a chilling effect on activism. There's always going to be those hardcore activists that no matter what laws are in place, they're going to do the work anyways, and they're going to put themselves on the front lines. But I think it does have a very real chilling effect, especially for organizations, because organizations through this legislation are facing like $250,000 fines if they're charged under this legislation in Ontario, for example. And so, that could end an organization, that could bankrupt an
Absolutely, it could.
organization. And so it is going to have a chilling effect and has had a chilling effect on things like undercover investigations when those laws are in place. And so, it is a really scary time in terms of looking at freedom of expression. And, really shocking too when we've seen how these laws have been struck down in other places. It was struck down in Ontario because of these issues and then, has now been overturned. So I don't think this is not the end of this conversation, and this will continue just as it has in the United States. But it is a very disappointing turn for Ontario for sure.
Um, Poplar is very upset by everything you're saying. So he almost never jumps up. I'm serious. This is very unusual here. Yeah, so PJ, can we talk a little bit about what can you just sort of review just this expose coming out and because a lot of people are wondering what do we do, what do we do, so can we talk a little bit just to remind people of what was said about that and also just if there's a first step that we can take getting prepared for that.
Sure, yes. So, as we've talked about, obviously there's a lot to expose, a lot for us to identify with what these groups are doing, the influence they're having on policy, on activists, on students. And so we are releasing like a pretty major report on this that is talking about specifically Canadian agriculture front groups, how they came to Canada and how they're influencing policy. And we'll include a section of recommendations for what people can do. And as a starting point, one thing that everybody could do is start to follow a few key front groups in Canada. So I'll just put these in the chat for anybody who wants to go do this. You can follow them on social media or look for where and how they appear in news stories. These are some of the most prominent groups, and it's helpful for everybody to kind of get to know them and see what they do. If they're not they don't have very high engagement on social media. You will be one of their few followers. And if you comment, you'll be one of the only commenters, even though they claim to to be doing work to engage the public. So this is just a starting point to get to know the groups more. And then we'll be sharing a lot more information about like them specifically and more actions that you can do. And in addition to that, all of this is also in the service of our work to call for more animal welfare regulation. Because a lot of what is being sought here is the avoidance of regulation through the appearance of it, through suppressing the truth from coming out, through, feeding youth propaganda. So a lot of what we're needing to do here is push for actual regulation, and a way that we're doing that right now is also from on our NFACTS website. So I'll just drop that in the chat because there is an action that folks can do there as well.
Yeah, and maybe we'll just this will be an action that we'll put out through the action team in the next bit, but we'll give you a little head start on it. We have a form letter on animal justices through animal justice to send to NFAC to demand the end to this industry dominated body. It's it's one of our form letter, but we're going to invite you. We've got another document that you can use to choose a different subject line, to choose a different body of the email. The more that we can sort of mix these up, the more, they will sort of take it seriously. So that's just been dropped into the chat. And so, you can grab both of those pages, and I'd invite you right after this is done, take action. This is one thing you can do. If we all, the rest of us that are left here, can send a message to NFAC tonight in different messages, different headlines, they won't know what hit them. So thank you so much. All right, let's, I want to ask a couple of questions that were in the chat, folks. Carrie's asking, why do animal ag organizations think animal farmers are the only farmers? Animal welfare-oriented activists are supportive of plant farmers. Well, let's start with the first part, because there are so many, and why are these groups so focused on animal agriculture? Anybody want to field that?
I can jump in to just mention an interesting thing that I observed, which was like some coverage of an animal welfare issue in a potato farming magazine a little while back. This was like something that came from Mercy for Animals and put out a story about something, and maybe it was a campaign. And there was like somebody from a different industry sort of saying like this approach is making us all look bad. Like there are industries that are doing like better for, people, the environment. And when everyone is sort of lumped in together with animal ag and this like propaganda machine, it really affects all the industries. So I think I have seen like bits of this, and I've heard it from others who have attended industry events too.
Mm. And I think it is important just to point out, as Matt did in the chat, yes, we are supportive of plant farmers who, grow to, create food for humans. Unfortunately, a majority of what plant farmers create in Canada goes towards animal feed. So these industries, like the plant farmers and the animal ag farmers, are quite interlinked, and so that makes it a little bit more muddy for us. Elizabeth, was there anything else you wanted to add to that? You don't need to, but I saw you start to.
Oh yeah, no. I think you've pretty much said what I was going to say, is that there is a lot of interconnectedness, and it is kind of complicated. They're not two completely separate streams. There definitely is overlap, and I think we tend to focus on the animal issues because that's the area that we work. But definitely the plant farming is a part of that, and I think we do recognize it. It's just that it sometimes seems secondary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another person is asking, is there a legal avenue to challenge this practice? And now I know we don't have our animal justice lawyers on the panel, but but in terms of more official sort of governmental organizations to do complaints around, and I'm sure this will be part of the expose, but does anybody sort of want to comment around that? No, Elizabeth's going first.
I think that's an interesting question, and I've often thought with the front group information and the information that industry groups put out that PJ covered. I have found it interesting to try and see it in the context of false advertising, because there with false advertising there is a legal avenue, and so to what degree is this false advertising? What is front group information actually advertising? And sometimes it's not that clear. Sometimes it's a feeling. Sometimes it's just trying to give an impression of something, and sometimes it's pretty blatant. But I think that is an interest. I think that's an area worth pursuing, because I think it can. I think we can zoom in on this kind of front group information more than we have to date, and look at it through the false advertising framework.
And there is just a lot of fluidity right now with the disinformation and the government trying to keep up to this and how to regulate it. So things are changing very quickly. This is something we have a lot of discussions about in the animal justice, digital quarters, so we are always trying to wrap our brains around this. Elizabeth, somebody else is asking about the front groups and why are they allowed to do this in schools? Can you explain like how they get in? Like they basically present it as educational information, and schools are open to having outside groups create some content. Is that correct?
Yeah, and think of it in the context of commodity groups that already have a really strong foothold in schools, like the dairy industry. They're already there. This is not, I mean, they're not having to knock on the door. They're already in there. And they're just adding this kind of material to what they already have in schools. I think a large part of the problem is schools are so underfunded, teachers are so overworked, and they're susceptible to somebody showing up with a complete package of materials that they can use and say, here, we've done it all for you. All you have to do is follow this guideline. It's fun, it's colorful, the kids are going to have a great time. And that's pretty appealing when you've got no money and too much work. And a lot of teachers don't know that much about agriculture, because they're no different than most people who really don't know a lot about agriculture. But it's not their fault that they don't know. It's because they're not being given the right information. So I think a large part of the problem is, A, the industry is already in schools, and B, schools and teachers are susceptible to accepting this kind of material out of desperation.
Yeah. And the government has a vested interest in the animal agriculture industry succeeding. So that's where funding comes from as well. Yeah.
Agriculture in the classroom, it gets so much government money to produce this material and create these programs. And agriculture departments tend to love it, that ag in the classroom is going into schools. I should point out, though, and I think maybe you made this point a while ago, Kimberly, is that the money they're getting is coming from agriculture departments, not education departments.
Yes.
So it's not,
right.
It's not, they're not in there as education, as a form of education. They're in there as a form of promotion for the agriculture industry.
Great. Thank you. Tayler, with activist criminalization also happening in the U.S., and this trend has started much earlier in the U.S. So there are a few years of us in terms of that. So based on what's happening in the U.S. right now, are we expecting things to get better or worse for animal advocates legally in Canada? Are we just at the beginning of the shitstorm, basically?
I mean, I hate to be that person, but I don't see it getting better in the short term, for sure. When I did my master's many, many years ago, this was sort of like the starting point of my research. And I said at that point, when we didn't have ag laws or anything in Canada, I used my master's work and I said, this should be a warning to activists of like what is to come in Canada over the next few years, because like we are using the United States as a blueprint here. Like we're following their playbook, we're doing what they've been doing for years. Our industries are pushing for this same sort of legislation. They were pushing for legislation similar to the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act in the United States, as well, which we don't currently have here, but industry has been pushing for it. And unfortunately, that did come true. Like we got ag laws, which many people said we would never get here, just based on, looking at the states and seeing how problematic they were. But they succeeded in a number of provinces here. And so I don't see it getting better in the short term. I don't think that means that it's never going to get better, but I think what we're pushing up an uphill battle here.
A huge mountain, huge mountain. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tayler. And it's okay. We forgive you for being that person.
Thank you.
So PJ, I think probably some people are feeling really amped up. They're like, oh my God, I'm so fired up about this. I'm ready to do something. But some people I'm sure are feeling very discouraged about what we're up against. Can you speak a little bit more? You kind of touched on this, to what's encouraging about how hard they're coming after us.
I would say, like, just kind of zooming out, like, we are in a pushback phase because of how successful we've been. Like, even all of us just being here today talking about this, thinking of the animal justice team essentially doubling in size in how many years? I mean, and all of us here who just like continue to grow as a community, I think like we're getting the pushback because of how successful we've been. And we're not less successful in the face of this. Like we're growing in the face of it because we have, truth on our side. I think compassion and all of our values like thrive, no matter what we're facing. In some ways, actually, like facing pushback builds a lot of resilience and brings us together. So that's how I see it, as like this goes for other social justice movements as well. Like we're in a moment right now of pushback, but that just gives us extra motivation to keep going. And very exciting to be bringing more people into this topic. Like that's, I think, a sign of our like growth and power as well.
Yeah, we had like 150 people at the height here listening to what's going on. And the other thing I'll point out, Elizabeth, when you mentioned they're sharing playbooks from the tobacco and the fossil fuel industries, like these major players. And so we are obviously like threatening something huge and on the wrong side. Okay. Groups that are trying to counter harm by seeding scientific doubts, having so-called citizen groups championing their industry, paying for experts, all of this stuff. And we know the tobacco industry, and the fossil fuel industry is definitely on the way down. So we've got a long way to go, folks, but I think it's really important to recognize that we're playing in the big leagues now. So can we go back to the gallery view, Kirsten, so we can see everybody that's left, our devoted community here that stayed. We are there's so many thank yous to all of our panelists yet. It's just the information you've uncovered is like staggeringly important. So PJ, Elizabeth, and Tayler, thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for being here and sharing it today. And thank you so much for this expose that's about to come. As long as you're on our animal justice list, folks, you will be getting this expose and all of the materials, and make sure that you are also on our animal justice action team list, so that you can be part of the rollout of the orchestrated actions we're going to be doing. More ways to get involved with animal justice: subscribe to Animal Justice. We'll drop the link in there. Join our Animal Justice Academy team and enroll in AJA. Our next panel will be mid-July, folks, and it's going to be Influencing for Animals. We're going to be featuring 5 influencers, including Lauren Toyota from Hot for Food blog, Danny Shea, I got it, who probably a lot of of you have seen. Some really exciting things going to be happening. They're going to be talking about how they've built their following and how you can become more influential in your own animal advocacy, no matter where you're at. So you can watch for us to send that registration page. I would like for us to unmute the whole team here, the whole community. Thank you for being a part of tonight, folks. And I think we can all say thank you to our panelists, PK, Elizabeth, Tayler. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for being
Thank
here.
you so much.
Oh, amazing. Go out there and be brave, be smart, be compassionate, folks. Thank you so much for being a part of this team. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.